Hey everybody, I'm back here today for a review that I would have liked to do a long time ago. Today, I'll be assessing the Foxfire Modular Blaster System. And I'll give you my opinion on every relevant aspect about it I can think of. First of all, the Foxfire MBS is intended to be a flywheel blaster platform that is modular and easily swapped between configurations of flywheel systems and firing modes, and maybe even the type of magazines it accepts. That aspect of the blaster will be explored and demonstrated further in depth from now. So, as for the external features of the blaster, I'll give my descriptions and opinions on the aesthetics, ergonomics, and other miscellaneous features. Starting with the aesthetics, my overall opinion is that they're mediocre. The appearance of this blaster is one of the major gripes I've heard many other people have had about it. I myself will say that I find the design, well, simplistic and rather unremarkable, but nothing offensive to my eyes by any means. Despite that, I still personally don't value the appearance of a blaster above all, and I do appreciate the functional, utilitarian nature of some designs. This blaster is a pass in that regard for me, though I still think it could have been done better. Moving on, my opinion on the ergonomics of the blaster are not that much better. The grip itself is one of the better aspects of the Foxfire's ergonomics. It isn't perfect either. The grip is on the thicker side in both relevant dimensions. This might be an issue if your hands are especially small, but personally, I don't think it's anything major. The triggers are great. They're snappy and I have nothing to complain about here. I do find having a flat area right above your trigger annoying, your main trigger annoying, but that's not a big deal either. Apart from that, there is the mag release. It's possible to hit it with your grip hand if you try, but generally that's not an option. Generally you'll have to engage it with your offhand, which is something some people prefer to do, and it may not be as big of a deal to other people. I personally am not a big fan of it though. Apart from that, I'm not too fond of the foregrip options for the assault housing. I find a magwell grip very uncomfortable due to this protruding section. I find a C-clamp uncomfortable just due to how thick the blaster's forend is. Do note that it's not impossible to get a good grip or a comfortable foregrip on this blaster, as there is a G flywheel housing that you can print out, and it does have a foregrip protruding out the bottom, which should be about as comfortable as the grip of the blaster itself. Finally, there are miscellaneous features of the blaster, such as the flared magwell and the tactical rail. Also, the jam door. As far as I'm concerned, the flared magwell actually does do its job, although you should note that there is no flare in the back, and this currently is not compatible with worker PMags or worker hex mags. Sorry, just got a notification there, distracted me a bit. I'm also not a fan of the sharp edges on this section where you're intended to grip the jam door by, although I understand that's also a consequence of designing for a decent print orientation. Finally, there's a sling mount at the bottom of the grip, and this is a serviceable location, but I would prefer for one higher up on the blaster around the rear end, but that's not the biggest deal in the world. Now for the internals. In mine, I'm currently running a 43mm Gen 1 open flywheel project cage. I just have tons of those lying around with FK180 PH-3735/45-2 motors, which I have even more of lying around, with a 16 gauge rewire with 15 amp clone switches. Something for me to immediately note is that the internals of the Foxfire can be highly variable, and I've only displayed a few of the possibilities represented here. Now, I'm not going to give a detailed breakdown of the internals, just describe enough to make sure you know what's going on. If detail was what you wanted, you could just go watch 498 Nerf's videos. It would be redundant if I just regurgitated that. What's important here will be my opinion, and in that regard, I'll remark on my opinions on the layout and the execution. Immediately, you'll note that this blaster is of clamshell construction, for the better or the worse. There are many design cues similar to that of a Strife, such as internal support structures and accommodations for all the required electrical components. However, there's something interesting here. In the Foxfire, there's this emphasis on securing parts by friction and their surroundings without hardware, in fact. I've personally found that this is something interesting. It's an approach that I admire, really. It's quite different from how I approach it myself, actually. Often, I'll secure parts by hardware alone, which sometimes does take up less room and is less effort, but I must admire the effort that went into this and the reduction in labor and sourcing parts for yourself to make this blaster become a reality in your arsenal. Some minor things to note is that the blaster does take strife cages. Personally, I found either my mounting posts were slightly out of tolerance for my printer or my cage was. It wasn't major enough to be unfixable, and it may not even be the fault of the design for all I know. As for a final tangent, if you take a look here, yes, it does in fact fit a 180 pusher. Apart from that, my overall opinion of the layout of the internals is that it's functional, executed in a way that I very much respect and think is done quite elegantly. Personally, I don't actually like clamshells, but I think it's been done well in this context. And I'll go more into depth on my final thoughts on all of this. Otherwise, I have no real complaints about the internals. Now, I've mentioned the blaster's modularity in passing for most of the video up until this point, and here I'll address it directly. So, say you wanted to switch your blaster from shooting 130 odd FPS to around 180. Well, assuming you have the housings and flywheel cages assembled and wired up for a single stage setup, a dual stage setup for that scenario in particular, it would be as easy as undoing these two screws in front, which I've already undone for the sake of time, pulling the hooks up, pulling the housing and the receiver apart, and undoing the connector. It's not a whole lot harder for swapping out the cores between semi-auto and full auto. Undo the hooks, pull them apart, and you can swap in a new one. The same thing applies to the magwell itself. You can actually swap between accepting full-length magazines or katana mags. As for how this has been executed, I think it's pretty solid. Both figuratively and metaphorically, I don't ever feel like the blaster is going to break apart those connection points just from handling it, although I personally do feel a little uneasy about it just from a design standpoint. In practice, I've had no issues and heard of no issues. As for how valuable I think these features actually are, my opinion is that it's cool and convenient, though not a necessity most of the time. As far as the actual field goes, I don't think most players or venues have a need for the ability to swap between firing modes or velocity that your blaster shoots at, which, now that I think of it, that's what an FTL does. Oh, whatever. Off that tangent, I think the real value of this modularity is in maintenance, actually. In preparation for games, it's a whole lot more convenient to be able to swap out flywheel cages just as easily as this, rather than having to disassemble an entire clamshell to just get to the flywheel cage. The same can be said swapping between semi-auto, full-length magazines, katana magazines. This isn't something players necessarily need either, but the quality quality of life improvement here is quite tangible, really. Now that that's been said and done, let's go to the firing demonstration. First up, we have semi-auto. Now after that firing demonstration, some things worth noting is that the pusher mechanism is basically non-functional, unless lubricated. This shouldn't be a big deal as 1, it's optimal for all pusher mechs to be lubricated, and 2, it feels perfectly fine after being lubricated. This is just something I thought was worth noting. Overall, no issues with its function in this regard. I'll swap out the cores and be back for the second part of the firing demo. And now, for full auto. Now, believe it or not, I was trying to actually single shot there, and I was unable to. That lack of ability to get consistent single shots is not just me being bad, it's also, as you can see, the cycle control is not completely consistent. It is wired dead center, but I have heard issues of having runaways with lower torque pushers, even on live center. I'd wager the minimum to get consistent retraction on this blaster in full auto is probably with a motor that can at least run 41.5mm cages, like Fein Revamp and above torque. Alright, now that I've covered everything else, here's where I give my distilled opinion on the blaster overall with maybe a few tangents. All in all, the Foxfire MBS is not only an interesting concept, it's also a well-executed realization of that concept. There are not many reference points in this hobby for a flywheel blaster that can swap between geometry, semi-auto, full auto, and accepting full-length magazines to taking katana magazines with as little effort as the MBS requires. And especially not at this price point, especially not all of them. As a result, it's not something I've seen done better, as I haven't seen it done at all, actually. But that's not to demean this blaster. It's, as far as having no reference point, it's actually a very executed realization, like I said. It's functionally not too clumsy, and it definitely has been done well enough where it has some actual use in practice. The rest of the blaster holds up to varying extents relative to its one major niche. The way it functions is nothing particularly innovative, of course, but it's been done elegantly enough that I have no major complaints. The ergonomics are a bit more troubled in my opinion. My opinion is that the grip is fine, there's nothing majorly wrong with that. Apart from that, of course, I'm not too fond of the position of the mag release. I'm not too fond of the foregrip, although it's not like you can't have a comfortable foregrip option with the Foxfire. There is the G housing, but I'm annoyed at the fact that the other grip solutions are not anywhere near as comfy. Finally, the aesthetics, which I personally think are not ugly, but some people may care more than I do or have a less flattering opinion. Finally, I'll speak on the tangents. The blaster's geometry makes printing some of its major components without supports basically impossible, and it's unavoidable. Yes, if you've optimized your printer, this is but an inconvenience, but if you're a lazy bum like me who's satisfied with good enough, it gets pretty tedious removing those supports. Speaking of which, it also took a bunch of post-processing to get many of these parts to fit together, and my file and my flush cutters were very busy putting this blaster together. Some of this is also a consequence of the clamshell design, and I'm not the biggest fan of clamshells in general, but this isn't the place to go into detail about that. Apart from that, the source files of the blaster are in Blender, which Blender is, well, not a CAD program. So being able to edit the files has that immediate barrier on it. Yes, the blaster is open source, and the fact that anyone with access to a printer can print it is cool in itself, but the other aspect, being able to modify the design, immediately has a soft barrier put in place by that. It's not like you can't edit the blaster, it's not saying that, it's just that it's harder than it should be or could be. Apart from that, I also suspect that the fact it's in Blender may cause some issue with slicers. The text Foxfire MBS here is not meant to be covered up, but my version of Cura 3 point something did so. This may vary from slicer to slicer, and it's not something that can't be fixed though, so that's not a big deal. Now, despite all of this potentially less than glowing feedback in the conclusion, my overall opinion of the blaster is still undeniably positive, and I'll restate for the final time, it's well, it's just more than a proof of concept. It's the first attempt at something, a cool concept, that's refined enough to be of actual use.